Hey guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be exploring something a little bit different. One of the main questions I always get asked is, how do you find inspiration for your own photography? And I like to find inspiration in a lot of places, but one of the main things that I actually love to do when I'm looking for inspiration for fashion editorials or test shoots or whatever I'm working on is actually by going through some of the past decades and looking at different types of fashion photography throughout the decades. So in today's video, we're going to talk about fashion photography over the decades, and I'm going to go all the way back to the 1920s and go all the way through to the 2010s. Now, one disclaimer, I'm not an expert in this particular field. I'm not a historian, so look, there's probably a lot of things here that are not going to be 100% accurate. Like I might have a few photos that might be from a crossover period, say between the 60s and 70s. And I have done my best to put credits in the video as well for a lot of the imagery. But unfortunately, when I was doing my research for this video, I did find it a little bit difficult to always find the credits for a particular photograph. So I'll do my best. For this video as well, I'm also going to be focusing on women in fashion photography. But if you'd like to see me do another video where I focus on men during the decades for fashion photography as well, I'd love to do that too. Just let me know in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's get into looking at some fashion photography throughout the decades, and I really hope you guys enjoy this video. Okay, so first off, we're going to look at the 1920s with fashion photography, and the 1920s is a really interesting decade for me because it's really the furthest we're going to go back today. And there's so much elegance in the works. The poses are so poised and everything is so carefully thought out, I feel, with these images. There's always a little bit of contrast, you know, with fur or with sequins or with things to really jump out in the photograph. And I think that's really cool because these days, you know, it's kind of anything goes with fashion photography. The light is one thing that really got me in the 1920s photographs and even into the 30s and 40s. And it's just so beautifully lit. I think that photographers back then had a very, very keen eye for light in particular. I think these days photographers also do, of course, but I think we've found a lot of different ways to make it work for us, even some unflattering lighting situations. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, they used to have a lot of actresses and singers posing for different fashion photographs, and that was a really common thing to do back then. And of course, it is still common these days, but of course, we also have a lot of models, and models are specifically a lot of the time used for fashion editorials, fashion campaigns, that sort of thing. So back then, they did tend to have a very theatrical presence in a lot of the fashion photographs, and you can really see that come through with some of the poses, the expressions. This photo is one of my favorites that I'm going to share with you guys today. Everything about it to me just is elegance. It is so beautiful. It inspires me to want to go out and photograph right now, but I can't because I'm in lockdown and I don't know how much longer I'm going to be in lockdown for. But this is just an incredible photograph. I mean, the composition of it, the dress that she's wearing and the way that it's draped across her in the photograph is just so beautiful. So the 1930s, we've got a very similar style in some of the imagery here compared to the 1920s. However, it starts to get a little bit more bold, I personally think. And I think there's a little bit more creativity in some of the posing. I think the theatrical element definitely flows through even into this decade for sure. One thing that I've noticed with a lot of the photographs throughout the 1930s as well is you've still got your actresses posing, and using a spotlight seems to be a very common way of lighting the models in these photographs. So I think that that's really cool. I think that's very reminiscent of that decade in particular. The poses are something that I really do find interesting. I think they're quite dramatic in some of these images, and they're quite rigid, quite posed, and not very candid as such, which I really do love. I love seeing that side of fashion photography where we don't always necessarily have candid shots. We have a lot of candid fashion photography and expressions and things like that these days. But back then it definitely had a feel about it, like everything had been curated, everything had been thought about before the image was taken. And of course, back when you were using film photography, you really did have to think about the images a lot more because you really couldn't stand there and snap away 500 photos at a time necessarily. Everything had to be thought out a lot more, and it's definitely apparent by looking at so many of these images from the 20s and the 30s and into the next few decades as well. And once again, it just amazes me that so many of these photos were taken on film. It makes me so inspired to get out there with a film camera right now and actually start doing film photography, but it costs a lot of money and I don't know if I'm going to have enough money after this pandemic ends for me to start doing film photography straight away, but We'll see. Okay, and so now on to the 1940s. So the 1940s kind of like branches out a little bit more, I think. You can kind of see the steady increments in each decade, which I find to be really interesting with how fashion photography has developed and even fashion itself. So looking at some of these images, they definitely are a little bit more daring with what some of the models are wearing in particular with the fashion style and also with the expressions. I've definitely seen in the 1940s images that I've collected here that there does tend to be a lot more expression used. There does tend to be a little bit more candidness. There's a little bit more happiness in the images. The 1940s definitely had the old movie star kind of style about the models and the fashion and everything like that as well. So as you can see in these photos, once again, actresses are a very popular choice for a lot of fashion editorials or fashion photographs. There's definitely a little bit more sex appeal as well that's showing up here as well, going into the 1950s decade too, with pinup. That was a really, really huge thing at the time. And in terms of the lighting that's used, it's very varied, but I do find that a spotlight is very popular still. There's a few more shots outdoors, like people are starting to experiment with fashion in the outdoor sense as well for editorials and campaigns and things like that. But mainly, I think overall, a very flattering light is used in a lot of these images. Obviously, the early 40s was a time of war, and I think that fashion was an escape for many people, and I think that that's very interesting. Now, for the 1950s, this is where things start to get really a lot more out there with fashion photography. The use of color is becoming really more prominent in imagery, particularly fashion imagery, and there's just a lot more creative elements. I think beauty portraits in particular are a really, really big thing in this time period, and actually I would love to do another video that focuses on beauty throughout the decades and beauty photography throughout the decades, because I think that would be maybe another interesting element to this, and it is very different to the fashion photography. So if you guys want to see that, let me know in the comment section below. But during the 1950s, there is once again a very wide variety of fashion that's really photographed. So you have very colorful, bold images at times, and you've got a lot of creative elements going on, but then you also have things that are a lot more elegant and still have that Hollywood feel to them, things that are a little bit more conservative. Obviously, people like Marilyn Monroe and Audrey Hepburn become more and more popular during this decade and into the 60s as well, so they are kind of like the stars of the decade, and they are obviously influencing fashion trends and things like that as well. I just love the use of settings during the 1950s. I think there was a little bit more of a push to incorporate some really interesting backdrops and backgrounds into the photos of a lot of the 50s fashion photographs. But yeah, you can see that there's a lot more creativity coming into these shots. The compositions are getting a little bit more different. The angles are a little bit more different with the models as well compared to the last 3 decades, where everything seemingly was quite structured within the fashion photographs. Here we get to see the photographers and the models going out of their comfort zones a little bit and creating some really interesting elements in the photographs. And now we have the 60s. Now the 1960s for me, when I first started photography, this is the decade that I drew so much inspiration from. I loved it. So during the 1960s, a lot of these images are a little bit more experimental. I think with the concepts, especially the space age or the future was such a big influence on that decade as well. So the fashion styles are just so completely different to those previous decades as well. And the hairstyles and particularly the makeup too. This is why I really want to do a beauty video on these decades, because it really goes into the makeup a lot more, and the makeup during the 1960s was such a huge focus for fashion photos. Twiggy was one of the most influential people at the time in terms of the modeling world, and she features in so many editorials and fashion photographs, and she really was an icon of the time. And the angles of the models and poses and compositions are just so different compared to so many of the other decades. I think the 50s and 60s is really where it starts to ramp up in terms of creativity with thinking of different angles and compositions. One thing that I noticed about the 1960s as well is that street fashion photography becomes a really big highlight of that decade. And then it starts to flow into the 1970s even more. A lot of publications focused on everyday people wearing everyday fashions of the decade, you know, just in the streets around where they live. Okay, so now moving into the 1970s and the 1970s, as I said with the 60s, street fashion photography really became a huge thing. And that's definitely the case with the 70s as well, even more so, I believe. One thing that I noticed about the 1970s fashion photography in particular is that makeup becomes less and less of a focus. I think especially well into the 70s, in that decade, it definitely becomes a little bit more about the fashion rather than just the makeup. The 60s had a really heavy influence on makeup, but I think a lot of the fashion photography from the 1970s shows a lot more of a pared back natural look in a lot of the images and on the models. I think color overall still plays a part in a lot of the fashion photography from the 70s, but one thing that really stood out to me as well well is that there's a lot more candidness in the photographs. Not everything is necessarily posed, not everything is a specific expression. There's a lot more laughter, there's a lot more free, candid expressions that I've noticed in the 1970s photos. And even with the poses, things are a lot more relaxed, a lot more natural. And I think with the 1970s being kind of known for hippies and that kind of like freedom effect, I think that that really shows in the fashion photography as well. Now, the 80s is a really interesting decade for me because the 80s, when I was growing up and even into the 2000s, it always kind of seemed a little bit of a daggy decade when it came to fashion. But looking back now and actually doing my research through this video, I'm actually blown away by some of the fashion photography of the 80s. And there's just something really, really powerful about a lot of the images, really interesting about them for me. I think it's really the first decade where you see women taking on a kind of a boss role. And that's what I really get from a lot of these images. It photographs women looking like very strong personas on camera. And I really feel like that's such a cool thing. A lot of these photos really capture women looking like they're in charge. And it really is a cool kind of thing to see from earlier on in the decades when you have these really meek and mild expressions and these really elegant dresses and everything seems so conservative. And now in the 80s, it's just kind of like bam. I think the 80s as well captured a lot of sex appeal too during this decade. It was definitely more of a freeing decade for women in particular. Once again, in these fashion photos, there's also a really cool variety between playing with color, which of course the 80s was known for, but then also stripping it back to something that's a lot more neutral or a lot more monochrome, which also seems to be a very big trend of the decade. And then we have the 90s, the decade that I was born in. So I can definitely see why the 90s is really coming back at the moment in a really big way, along with the early 2000s as well. The 90s was once again a really interesting decade. There seemed to be a lot more creative freedom, and I think that there was a lot more candidness once again in the photography. There were lots of creative concepts, the expressions were varied. Everything sort of seemed very freeing during this decade, especially for women. And I think you had so many different trends going on too with fashion, but I definitely feel like candidness was definitely something that really stuck out to me looking at a lot of the fashion photographs from this decade. You also had a lot of huge name supermodels like Naomi Campbell, Tyra Banks, Christy Turlington, Linda Evangelista, and Kate Moss, of course, during the decade that really defined a lot of the fashion photographs that are out there. It's funny because me growing up throughout the early 2000s, once again, I kind of thought of the 90s and my old fashion styles as something that would probably never come back and something that would never come back into fashion photographs especially. But looking now, I think it's just so easy to see why it's such a popular thing these days to draw an inspiration from the 90s fashion photos as well. 90s grunge as well was something that really played a part in a lot of fashion photos, and you can really see that in some of the photos. And then we move into the 2000s. So once again, you've got some really big name models that are really directing the whole style of fashion photography, I think, throughout this decade. And I have to say, really at the beginning of the 2000s, I feel like that's where fashion finally had no bounds. There was no boundaries, there was no limits. Everything just kind of lifted and complete creativity was really in effect. A lot more daring poses and outfits and colors. I definitely found that creative concepts became more of a focus with a lot of fashion photographs during this decade in particular. I think probably ever since around the 80s and 90s, it seemed to be really cool, interesting concepts that were always thought of for different editorials in magazines. But I think this is a really cool decade to take some inspiration from for sure. And then we get to the 2010s, and I have to say, I think the 2010s, and of course now the 2020s, which is really weird to say, I think that these are my favorite decades because I think you finally get to these decades, and of course you always want to draw inspiration from earlier decades and older times, but I think that there's something about the 2010s in particular where you really start to see that there are no boundaries anymore. There is so much more inclusiveness, which really needs to improve even more so, I think. But I think it's definitely getting there, and we're starting to see more and more interesting concepts, interesting ways of portraying fashion in fashion editorials and photography. And the creativity is endless. And that's something that I love thinking about because I know that I'm not limited to photographing a certain way. I don't have to use certain colors or styles necessarily, or lighting methods with my work. I'm really excited to see where fashion photography continues to go. All right, guys, well, I hope you really enjoyed this video and I hope you found it interesting. Please let me know what your favorite decade is of fashion photography down in the comments section below, because I'm really interested to hear what you think. And let me know what your favorite photo was that you saw from today as well, because I also want to know that too. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, make sure that you do, because I will be posting more content like this in future. But thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.